Hello, hello, here we are, Welcomer Chapter 9. This is the second time I'm doing Welcomer Chapter 9 because the first time I lectured on it, I had my volume all the way down on my computer. So here we go again. Hey, this is adolescence, adulthood, and the future, and there is some overlap with your Zagger Chapter 13, which is also assigned for this week. So I kind of skip those sections when we get to them. I can mention it, but essentially they're adequately presented in your Zagger text. So things like vocation and employment and that sort of thing. But anyway, this chapter, Welcomer's chapter, starts with a lengthy discussion on puberty. Some important things to consider is basically puberty is biological, it's not developmental. So it's not going to be delayed in individuals with ASD. It's going to happen naturally like it happens to anyone else. So the problem is it can be really difficult for children with ASD for lots of different reasons. Difficult for caretakers and school professionals and service providers and all that sort of thing. But one reason is that it's not always possible to totally prepare the child for the changes. So it may be they don't have the cognitive ability to understand the explanation. There might be this language barrier. So preparation is sometimes difficult. There's rapid mood changes that are very frustrating and can be magnified during this time. Behaviors become harder to physically manage. So you can imagine the young little ones that are 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, they can be really hard to manage physically in their little 30, 40-pound selves. So as individuals hit puberty and become physically mature, then are much stronger and harder to manage physically if that needs to be the case. A big problem is that it's hard to know what is normal adolescence and what are new challenges. So for individuals that are providing services to individuals on the spectrum, it's hard to know if, what's going on, this is just typical, it's going to phase out once we get through puberty, or are these new things that we need to be thinking about and intervening in. And of course, there's also this increased risk of developing seizures during adolescence, so a big thing to watch out for. Behavior problems. Puberty may amplify the pre-existing difficulties. New types of behaviors might develop. But what we do find is that many behaviors do get better. It's kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that, you do start to see an improvement in a large majority of individuals on the spectrum in adolescence. However, there's then this new emerging sense of the fact that they are different, and they want to fit in, and yet they don't completely. And so there's that frustration and, again, depression, anxiety, those sorts of things that might emerge. Sexuality, oh goodness, there's lots to consider here. There's some individuals, just like typically developing, some will have strong sexual feelings and some will not. Some have strong desires for boyfriends and girlfriends, and it's just difficult. It's difficult to understand that sexual feelings are related to relationships, long-term relationships, the idea of love versus sex. We have this issue of contraception and STDs. So lots of considerations that need to take place related to sexuality. You think this falls a lot to parents, but professionals have to contend with these things a lot as well. The chapter actually gives a pretty funny example of a boy in adolescence on the spectrum who he basically, his technique was during the lunchroom he would stare at a girl very intently for a very long time, and eventually she would come over and say, "Hey, what do you want?" And he would then provide a very explicit sexual request. And so he had to be taught in the school setting what is appropriate and isn't, and what you can say and can't say. And even though you're thinking it and that is what you want, and she did ask, "What do you want?" You can't reply with those types of things. So maybe something you encounter. the education about issues of sexuality can really be complicated again by the language and communication difficulties and the social problems. For typically developing peers, often the most common source of information regarding sexual activity and sexuality are peers. And individuals on the spectrum typically don't have any peers, and so they actually don't have access to that information. Now, as a parent, you may find this good or bad, but the text presents it as a negative in terms of they don't have access to that information from their peers. So, explicit teaching can be really helpful. Teaching the difference between public and private behavior, really difficult. I find it difficult with my 3.5-year-old. There's this idea with public and private behavior. Part of the problem is that the individual has to make a judgment. They have to have an appreciation of the context they're in and determine, is this appropriate? Is this public behavior or private behavior, and where I'm at? And I remember reading, it must have been in one of your texts, but about an individual, an adult man who was on the spectrum, and where did they take him? To a concert, I think. Maybe he liked classical music or something, and they took him to a concert, and at intermission or at the end of the concert or whatever, he went into the restroom, and the person's there waiting for him outside the door, and apparently all these men started rushing out of the bathroom in a hurry, and when they went in to go see what the issue was, the individual on the spectrum, basically what he had always learned was if he needed to use the restroom, he had to first take off all his clothes. And so he had continued that through adulthood. And so he was stripping naked in the classical concert facility in order to use the restroom. And so, so obviously needed some intervention on what is public and private behavior. There's also the issue that's been brought up before, but this idea of being able to say no, teaching individuals on the spectrum and individuals with disabilities to say no and to know that there are boundaries of what can and can't be crossed and who should touch what when and if they can and all that sort of thing. Goodness, it's so hard. Again, I struggle with that just teaching my own children. So anyway, what can be helpful is guided rehearsal, practice, very open discussions, and depending on the individual and their level of disability and that sort of thing, you may need help of a specialist. Then there's high school, and there are challenges related to high school. Essentially, adolescents in high school are functioning at a very high social level, problematic for individuals on the spectrum. The academic and cognitive demands are much greater. There's this demand for self-directed learning and self-monitoring and organization. Often the physical environment of the school can be difficult. It's large and complex, and you go to switch classes and there's all these social issues that are taking place in between. So just the environment of the school can be difficult. Self-care and personal hygiene demands are much greater, and individuals on the spectrum often struggle in that area. Peer groups, acceptance, and kind of this orientation toward peers and away from parents and siblings and that sort of thing is taking place. And of course, that's a area of struggle for individuals on the spectrum. So, transition planning should be really important and high on the list of priorities. It should be part of the IEP process. Of course, there should be careful consideration for the individual's interests, their abilities, their areas of challenge, and determining where they're going to go and what they're going to need to know. Are they going to need to know how to drive? Then that's a whole other issue. Are they going to be able to take the bus system? Well, then you have to teach that. So all these areas should be considered. Of course, it's highly individualized as always. Something to consider when we're talking about the transition to college or vocational programs and schools and that sort of thing is that it's no longer a right. It's no longer a right the way that it is for individuals to receive, a free and appropriate education. So in college, students have to self-identify. The parents cannot do this for them. Once they do that, then they're able to receive some supports, but that first step has to be taken by them. They have to learn appropriate interactions, what's appropriate to say and do in the classroom, and oftentimes there are complaints about individuals on the spectrum appearing to be threatening or harassing. Typically not the case. Typically, individuals on the spectrum are much more likely to be a victim of harassment and that sort of thing, but their behaviors can come across as such oftentimes. They have to function relatively autonomously, so this can be difficult. There are peer mentors and often group therapies that may be really helpful in these areas. Vocational training programs and independent living skills, these all need to be taught very explicitly. Again, hygiene and self-care skills, modeling these in the home, having individuals on the spectrum grow up seeing this being done and how to do it and how often and that sort of thing. But also teachers and professionals can be really helpful in this area and teach these skills. In moving into adulthood, there's a section that talks about prediction in terms of how well can we predict how well an individual on the spectrum is going to do. Hard to do, right? Hard to predict that. But some things that give us good indicators are this presence of truly communicative speech by the age of 5 is kind of the in small print there. The nonverbal cognitive ability has to be very high, and self-sufficiency and independence very high. So if those things are in place, then we see a pretty good prediction in terms of how an individual will be able to do in adulthood. We do, again, see gains in adolescence a lot of times, although we still continue to see the social oddity that remains into adulthood. They certainly have potential for long-term relationships, and some studies have found that essentially there's a number of good outcomes. The number of good outcomes have about doubled since 1980, with fewer individuals having poorer outcomes over time. So these are good indicators. In adulthood, though, there's a lot of new challenges that are related to mental health and medical issues. New challenges, compulsive behaviors, sexual behaviors, aggression, depression, anxiety, and kind of the medical issues related for anyone, for growing old. And you can imagine all the different complications related to these. It's sometimes a huge deal for, I have a friend who is on Facebook who has a son with autism, and she's always posting about finding professionals that can work with her son. So her son has to go to the dentist regularly, and she needs a pediatric dentist that can work with individuals on the spectrum. So, and that's the dentist. It's not a physician that has to sometimes be very intrusive. So you can imagine all the difficulties associated with this. Vocational issues, this is kind of where I skipped along because we covered it in Zager already. Sheltered workshops are often an option in terms of vocational. There's the shelter workshops are really these protected environments. There's minimal challenges. It allows for community involvement and that sort of thing. Secured employment, which is supported in a less restrictive setting. Supported employment, that's that typical kind of job coach model. Again, that's all discussed in the other lecture. And, of course, independent settings. In planning for the future, there is a lot to think about. And, oh goodness, there's a lot of detail here. There's a lot of information related to planning for the future. And when you're talking about health insurance, government benefits, guardianship and legal issues, estate planning, marriage, there's a whole lot of information in the chapter related to these. I kind of am going to leave it up to you to read that if you see that it will be helpful for you. But for the most part, very much aimed at parents and guardians. It's very complex in terms of what money can be left to individuals, what money will become property of the state or claimed by the state, what money, assets, things that will be left to the individual will become part of a calculation that would disqualify them from getting health insurance and qualifying for benefits and all this sort of thing. It's very complicated. Kind of the overarching voice of this whole section is talk to lawyers that are specialists in this area and talk to them now and plan as much as possible. Plan for the will, plan for guardianship, plan for every piece of everything. And really the complicated piece is the money pieces, because it becomes so complex in terms of not putting the individual at risk for losing services that they would otherwise qualify for. So go ahead and read that if you're interested, or if it applies to you, if you think it's helpful. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move on. That's all I have for Volkmar's Chapter 9. So that's it for this week. If you guys have any questions at all, please let me know. Really, I struggle with not being able to see you all the time. So feel free to communicate with me all the time. Have a good week. Bye-bye.